Ever wish you could reach back in time and solve a historical mystery? Wait, get ready, because today we're diving into a case that's got it all. Archaeology, DNA analysis, and a medieval saga.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating one. It's got all those elements, plus a real person at the center of it all.
Yeah.
A guy whose story's been hidden for centuries.
Right, and talk about a dramatic discovery. Back in 1938, archaeologists were working at Sverre's Borg. It's this medieval castle in Trondheim, Norway, and they find a skeleton right there in a well.
It's like something straight out of the history books, huh?
Totally. And get this, it seems to match up with this dramatic scene described in Sverre's saga, a historical account from 1197.
The saga. Yeah, it tells us about how these enemy forces, they were called the Baglers, they tried to poison the defenders of the castle, the Birkebeinerne, by throwing a dead man into the well.
Yeah. I mean, talk about a chilling story. But like with any good historical mystery, I feel like there's got to be more to it than meets the eye, right?
You hit the nail on the head there. The saga is our primary source, but we always got to remember it was written by, the victors. So maybe, just maybe, it's not giving us the whole picture.
So we have this crazy historical narrative, but how do we know what's fact and what's, embellished? Is that where archaeology and science come in?
Exactly. Archaeology and science can give us that hard evidence to, test the saga's claims against.
So they find the skeleton, centuries after the saga was written. That seems to back up the story, right? But then what? We don't figure everything out right then.
Well, the technology to really dive deep, that came much later. It wasn't until the 21st century that we could really get to the bottom of this.
Gotcha. So what happens in the 21st century?
Well, they decide to go back to that well and retrieve the skeleton. Sounds simple enough, right? But, oh man, was it a challenge. This well was deep, filled with water, and just packed with debris. I'm talking stuff from the medieval period and even later from World War II when German forces used it as a trash pit.
A medieval, well-turned WWII trash pit. Wow. That's layers of history right there.
Talk about an archaeological puzzle. But, you won't believe this, they managed to recover over 90% of the skeleton. Pretty incredible, given everything it had been through.
That's amazing. So what did they learn about this guy? What did his bones tell them?
Okay, so based on the skeletal structure, we know he was a robust dude, about 175 to 180 centimeters tall.
Whoa, that's pretty tall, especially for that time period, right?
Yeah, for back then, he was a giant. And likely in his late 30s.
Okay, so we're starting to get a picture of him. Sounds like he wasn't your average Joe, even by medieval standards. So what else can you tell me about his life?
Well, it looks like he lived a tough life, a very physically demanding one. See, his bones showed evidence of some spinal problems.
Spinal problems. Oof, that's rough. What do you think caused that?
It could be from heavy lifting, or maybe some kind of repetitive strain. Really points to him doing some serious manual labor.
Wow. So he's a big guy, tough, and he's worked hard all his life. Makes you wonder what else he went through,
Well, there's more. Remember those pleural plaques on his rib cage I mentioned?
Yeah, I remember.
Those suggest that he likely suffered from tuberculosis. Or it could have been some other kind of lung disease. Maybe something he got from all the dust he was inhaling.
So maybe it was his job or the environment he lived in?
Could be.
Yeah.
Either way, not an easy life. And this is all before we even get to the really surprising part, the DNA analysis.
Oh, I've been waiting for this. The DNA. That's where things get really interesting, right?
Absolutely. So from the DNA, we learned a few things. First, he was blonde, blue-eyed.
Makes sense, right? Given where he's from.
Yeah, not a surprise there. But here's the shocker. His genetic ancestry traces back to the Agder region, which is in southern Norway.
Southern Norway. Wait a minute, that's hundreds of kilometers away from Trondheim.
Yeah, you got it. Hundreds of kilometers.
It changes everything.
It really throws a wrench into our initial assumptions, right?
Right.
You find a skeleton that seems to line up with this historical saga, but then the DNA tells a whole different story.
It's like a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit, but it opens up all these new possibilities. So if he wasn't a Birkebeinerne from Trøndelag, who was he? How did he end up so far from home?
Well, we had to think about the context, right? Norway, in the late 12th century, it was a chaotic time. The Birkebeinerne and Bagler were locked in this bitter power struggle.
His saga is basically all about this conflict, right?
Exactly. Civil war, basically.
Yeah.
And it was raging all over the country.
So this Agder Man, he could have been caught up in all that.
Absolutely. Even in times of war, you still have people moving around for trade, or looking for work, or even just trying to escape the fighting.
So maybe he was a merchant, A traveling craftsman or a refugee?
Could be any of those. It's just fascinating to think about, you know. This one skeleton is giving us a glimpse into the lives of everyday people during this turbulent period.
It's like we're getting a peek behind the curtain of the big historical narrative. Instead of just kings and battles, we're seeing the human side of history.
Exactly. And it reminds us that the saga, while a valuable source, is just one perspective, one version of events. There were so many other stories happening at the same time, stories that might never be told.
It's both exciting and humbling, you know? We can learn so much from the past, but there's always so much more that we don't know.
That's the beauty of history, right?
I
There's
agree.
always something new to uncover. But speaking of uncovering, remember we talked about how there wasn't much in the way of clothing found with the skeleton?
Yeah, I remember that. Except for that one shoe, right?
Exactly. Just one shoe, still on his right foot after all these centuries. It's kind of eerie, but also amazing.
It's like a direct link to the past. I'm curious, what can that shoe tell us?
Well, the fact that it was still on his foot suggests that he wasn't buried in the traditional sense, you know, prepared for a proper burial.
So that seems to support the saga's claim about him being thrown into the well.
It's possible, yeah. Maybe he was stripped of his other clothes, or maybe they just decomposed over time. We can't say for sure.
So we're back to the big question. If he wasn't a local Birkebiner, what are the other possibilities?
Right. Let's dive into that, shall we?
Let's do it. It's like we're playing historical detective here.
Okay, so one possibility is that he was a Bagler. Maybe he was killed in battle or died of disease, and his body was dumped in the well as an act of, like, disrespect. Or maybe to scare the defenders.
That's a pretty dark thought, but it would explain his southern origins and the lack of a proper burial.
Right. But there are other possibilities, too. What if he wasn't a soldier at all? What if he was just a craftsman, a laborer working at the castle? Maybe he got caught in the crossfire, a victim of the chaos of war.
Or maybe he was just passing through Trondheim, at the worst possible time. A traveler with no connection to the conflict at all who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
That's a possibility, too. The DNA evidence opens up so many different scenarios, it's amazing. It really forces us to think beyond the limited perspective of the saga.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into the lives of those who are often forgotten by history, the everyday people who are just trying to survive amidst all the chaos.
Exactly. Their stories are just as important as the stories of the kings and warriors. And now, with tools like DNA analysis, we have a way to start uncovering those stories.
This is what I love about this field. There are always new discoveries being made, new technologies that allow us to see the past in a whole new light.
It's a never-ending journey of exploration. But speaking of journeys, we've talked a lot about where the Agder Man might have come from and how he might have died. But what about his life? Remember we talked about his spinal problems and lung disease? What can those tell us about life in medieval Norway?
Yeah, those are pretty rough conditions. It makes you wonder what everyday life was like for most people back then.
Well, the spinal problems are a pretty clear indicator of a life of hard labor. It suggests that most people, whether they were farmers, laborers, or even soldiers, were doing physically demanding work from a young age.
And the lung disease just highlights how prevalent illness was back then and how limited their medical knowledge was.
Right. It's a sobering reminder that life in the Middle Ages, even for someone as robust as the Agder Man, was full of hardship and uncertainty.
It definitely makes you appreciate modern medicine, that's for sure.
Wow.
But even though he had a tough life, the Agder Man's story is valuable to us today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. He's not just a fascinating individual, he's also a representative of the broader population. His remains give us valuable insights into the health and living conditions of people in medieval Norway.
It's like we're looking through a window into the past, seeing not just the big events, but also the everyday lives of ordinary people.
Exactly. And those everyday lives, they're just as important as the wars and the political intrigues. They help us understand the full tapestry of history.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, haven't we? The saga's account, the archaeological evidence, the DNA analysis, and even what we can learn about daily life from the Agder Man's health. But before we move on, there's one more thing I want to touch on, the significance of this discovery for the field of history as a whole.
The Agder Man, he's a game changer. His case really highlights how new technologies, especially DNA analysis, are revolutionizing the way we study history.
Right. It's not just about reading old texts and examining artifacts anymore. Now we have this amazing tool that can tell us so much more. We can trace ancestry, identify individuals, even reconstruct what people looked like. It's incredible.
It's like having a whole new set of lenses to view the past through. And with these new tools, we can re-examine old assumptions, challenge existing narratives, and uncover stories that were previously hidden.
The Agder Man's case is a perfect example of that. And it wouldn't have been possible without collaboration between historians, archaeologists, geneticists, and other experts. It really shows the power of interdisciplinary research.
Absolutely. It's a team effort, and it's leading to some truly remarkable discoveries. And it reminds us that history is not static. It's a dynamic field that's constantly evolving as new evidence comes to light.
And who knows what other mysteries are out there just waiting to be uncovered?
That's the exciting part, right?
Yeah.
The past is full of secrets, and with every new discovery, we get a little bit closer to understanding who we are and where we came from.
Well said. Well, before we wrap things up, I want to bring it back to the Agder Man one last time. It's pretty amazing, you know? We started with this, like, one little mention of a guy in a well in this old saga. And now, thanks to archaeology and science, we've got this whole picture of who he might have been.
It shows just how powerful these different fields can be when they work together, right? History, archaeology, DNA analysis, they all come together to tell us this incredible story.
And people are eating it up. Ever since the research on the Agder Man came out, everyone's been obsessed with this mystery.
Yeah, it's really captured the public imagination, hasn't it? Like, I've seen online forums dedicated to this guy. People are coming up with all sorts of theories about who he was and what happened to him.
Yeah, me too. It's really cool to see so many people getting invested in history like that. It's like he's become a symbol for all the everyday people, you know, whose lives don't always make it into the history books.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about kings and queens and battles. It's about regular people, just like us, who lived and loved and struggled just like we do today.
And their stories are just as important, maybe even more so because they give us a glimpse into what life was really like back then.
Exactly. And by studying those lives, we get a much richer and more, I don't know, human understanding of the past.
Well, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from the saga and the archaeology to the DNA analysis and what the Agder Man's health can tell us. But even with all that, there's still this big question mark hanging over everything. Look, we still don't know for sure how he ended up in that well.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You
We
might
don't-
never know the full story.
What's your gut feeling? What do you think happened to him?
Honestly, I'm still leaning toward him being caught in the crossfire of the conflict. Maybe he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure. But that's what makes this case so fascinating, right? It's a puzzle with missing pieces. We can gather evidence, analyze the facts, and make educated guesses, but we may never know the whole truth.
It's a good reminder that history is not always neat and tidy. Sometimes we're left with more questions than answers. But that's okay. It just means there's more to explore, more to learn.
Exactly. And that's what we're all about here, right? Exploring the past, uncovering those hidden stories, and trying to understand the world a little bit better. So, for everyone listening, what are your thoughts on the Agder Man? What theories have you come up with? Head over to our social media pages and let us know. We want to hear what you think. And until next time, keep those history brains buzzing, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.